My husband sat across the long table swirling his pen as he prepared to sign away our marriage. He looked at me with that pitying smile, calling me a burden and a tragic cost of the accident. He truly believes I do not remember the things he whispered into my ear while I lay in a coma for 3 months. He thinks he is escaping with his reputation intact. I think he is just beginning his long fall. My name is Harper Lane. I am 36 years old, and until recently, I was a lead cybersecurity analyst for a top-tier fintech firm. Today, however, I am simply the silent woman sitting across the polished mahogany table from the man who once vowed to love me in sickness and in health. We were seated in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of the Phoenix County Mediation Center. The air was cold, smelling of stale coffee and expensive cologne. Opposite me, Ethan Calder leaned back in his leather chair, the very picture of relaxed arrogance. He twirled his fountain pen between his fingers, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at the divorce settlement and accident compensation agreement lying between us. Ethan turned his charm toward the mediator, his voice dripping with a mixture of pity and condescension. "Honestly, Raymond, we need to be gentle here," he said, gesturing loosely in my direction. "Harper has not been completely stable since she woke up from the coma. The brain injury changes a person. She is essentially a lingering cost of the accident now, a liability I am trying to manage gracefully. I just want her to sign so she can get the help she needs, even if she does not quite understand the numbers." His lawyer, a seasoned shark named Monroe with ice blonde hair and a suit that cost more than most people's cars, nodded in agreement. Her tone was soft but carried a serrated edge. "Mr. Calder is being incredibly generous with this offer," she said, tapping a manicured fingernail on the document. "Considering Mrs. Calder has not contributed a single dollar to the household finances since the crash and is unlikely to return to the workforce. This lump sum is a gift. It is more than enough for someone with no financial leverage." I kept my face completely void of emotion. I did not blink. I did not frown. My hands rested calmly on the table, placed squarely on top of a thick ash-gray folder. It was sealed tight with red tape. To them, it probably looked like a stack of disorganized medical records or perhaps a desperate collection of sentimental photos I had brought along to beg for his affection. I could see Ethan eyeing it with dismissal, assuming it was just another symptom of my supposed cognitive decline. Raymond, the mediator, looked like a man who had seen every possible variation of marital collapse and was thoroughly bored by ours. He was a man in his 50s with tired eyes who checked the clock on the wall. "Does the wife's side have any additions or contestations before we proceed to the formal signing?" he asked, his tone making it clear he did not expect a real answer. Ethan checked his watch, an ostentatious platinum piece I had bought him for our 5th anniversary. "Come on, let us not drag this out," he said, his patience snapping as he thought of his schedule. "I have a board meeting at the hospital at 4 this afternoon. Do not make a scene over the paperwork. Harper, you were in a coma for months. You are lucky to even be sitting here breathing. Just take the money and sign." I did not flinch at his aggression. Instead, I slowly slid the heavy gray folder across the smooth wood until it rested directly in front of Raymond. "This is a supplementary disclosure statement," I said, my voice steady, clear, and utterly devoid of the confusion they expected. "It is required reading before any party signs a binding agreement." Ethan threw his head back and laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the glass walls. "What is that? Did you write me a love letter in there? Are you asking me to forgive you? Please, Harper, do not embarrass yourself further." I looked him dead in the eyes. He saw a broken woman. He saw a burden. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he thought was brain damaged had spent the last month building a cage around him. If only he knew what he had whispered to me in the dark when he thought I was nothing more than a motionless body. If he knew that every hateful word, every confession, Every plan he hatched by my bedside had been recorded in the steel trap of my mind. He would not be laughing. He would be terrified. But to understand why his smile is about to die, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the days before I knew my husband wanted me dead. 1 year ago, life in the suburb of West Ridge felt like a carefully curated exhibit of the American dream. We lived in a 2-story colonial on a street lined with oak trees, where the lawns were manicured to within an inch of their lives and the neighbors waved with practiced cheerfulness. To anyone looking through our bay windows, my marriage to Ethan Calder appeared flawless. He was the handsome, tireless emergency room doctor at St. Barrow Hospital, the kind of man who saved lives and still made it home for dinner, looking weary but noble in his scrubs. It was the sort of life they sell you in insurance commercials, safe and predictable. Our daughter, Lily, was the heartbeat of that home. She was 6 years old then, a bundle of energy with messy pigtails and a laugh that could crack open the sky. She was my entire world. Ethan loved her, of course, but his fatherhood was performative. He was the type of dad who would lift her high in the air for a perfect Instagram photo, captioning it with something sentimental about his little princess, only to hand her back to me the moment she started crying or needed a snack. There was no abuse, no raised voices, just a distinct emotional distance. I was the parent who knew her allergies and her fears. He was the parent who knew her best angles for social media. I had made peace with that dynamic because I valued my role. Before Lily, I had been a senior cybersecurity analyst at Northline Digital, hunting down vulnerabilities in banking systems. When she was born, I stepped back to part-time freelance work to manage the household. I still took on contracts, still kept my skills sharp, and still deposited checks into our account. But in Ethan's eyes, I had simply become a housewife. The cracks in our facade became undeniable during the 40th wedding anniversary dinner for his parents. We were gathered at their sprawling estate in Maple Heights, a neighborhood where the driveways were heated and the silence was expensive. I was wearing a new navy dress I had bought for the occasion. Ethan's mother, Ellis, greeted us at the door with a glass of Chardonnay in hand. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the fabric of my dress. "It is a lovely color on you, Harper," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It must be so convenient to have so much free time during the week to go shopping. I remember when I was raising the boys. I barely had time to think, let alone browse boutiques." I tightened my grip on my purse but forced a smile. Beside me, Ethan did not even blink. We moved to the dining table, where the conversation was dominated by Ethan's sister, Brooke. She worked at a high-end public relations agency and thrived on passive aggression. As the main course was served, Brooke looked over at Ethan and sighed dramatically. "It must be so relieving for you, Harper," she said, addressing me but looking at her brother. "To have a doctor for a husband means you never really have to worry about how the bills get paid. It is such a safety net." The table chuckled politely. I was busy cutting up a piece of roast beef for Lily, who was swinging her legs under her chair. I kept my head down, focusing on the knife and fork, pretending the comment had not landed. The conversation naturally drifted toward the stock market and investments. Ethan leaned back, swirling his wine, and began explaining his portfolio strategy to his father. He spoke loudly, ensuring everyone heard how he was carrying the family finances. He mentioned that he had to be aggressive with his investments because I was not ready to return to the labor market after becoming a mother. The family nodded in unison, accepting his narrative as the absolute truth. I cleared my throat. "Actually, I noticed the trading app you are using has some significant security vulnerabilities in their latest patch," I said, trying to insert myself into the conversation as an equal. "I read a report on it last week. You might want to switch platforms before they patch the leak." The table went silent for a second. Then Ellis patted my hand gently. "Oh, sweetie, leave the technical talk to the men," she said softly. "Let us just enjoy the wine." I felt my face heat up. I was the only person at that table who could code, the only one who understood encryption protocols. Yet I was being dismissed as if I were a child interrupting adults. Later in the evening, a male cousin who had enjoyed a few too many scotches slapped Ethan on the back. He laughed loudly and said that if the two of us ever divorced, at least Ethan would be out of it quickly since the wife did not have anything in her name anyway. Ethan laughed along with him. He did not defend me. He did not correct him. He just shrugged and said that Harper is a good woman and she is not going anywhere, so there is nothing to worry about. I sat there, freezing in the warmth of the dining room. I looked at Lily, who was happily coloring in a book beside me, oblivious to the fact that her mother was being appraised like a piece of depreciating furniture. I swallowed the humiliation along with the expensive wine, telling myself it was harmless banter. I had no idea that this was not just a bad family dinner. It was the prologue to a plan where they would try to turn me into a zero. It was raining sheets of water that night. I was driving home from a parent-teacher conference at Lily's school, my mind preoccupied with her reading scores and the grocery list. As I approached the sharp curve near the old bridge, I tapped the brakes to slow down. The pedal did not resist. It sank all the way to the floor mat with a sickening softness. I pumped it again, panic spiking in my chest, but the car simply accelerated into the turn. I remember the terrifying weightlessness as the tires lost traction, the scream of metal grinding against the guardrail, and the violent shattering of glass. The world spun upside down. The airbag detonated like a punch to the face, filling the cabin with white dust, and then the lights went out. I did not wake up in a hospital room. I woke up in a coffin made of my own flesh. My mind drifted back to consciousness in a thick, suffocating darkness, but my body refused to follow. I could hear everything. The rhythmic, high-pitched beep of the heart monitor became my new clock. The smell of industrial antiseptic burned my nose. I felt the vibration of footsteps on the linoleum floor. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were weighted down with lead. I tried to twitch a finger, to gasp, to scream, but nothing moved. I was a ghost trapped inside a statue. Somewhere above me, a doctor was speaking to Ethan. He used words like severe traumatic brain injury and cognitive deficit. He explained that if I ever woke up, I might not be the person I was before. I waited for Ethan to ask about my pain or my chances of recovery. Instead, I heard him let out a long, heavy sigh. It was the specific sigh he used when he opened a bill that was higher than expected. It was the sound of a man calculating a financial inconvenience. Later, when the room was quiet, I felt his breath against my ear. He leaned in close, his voice a soft whisper that might have looked like affection to a passerby. "You know, Harper," he said, his tone chillingly conversational. "If you do not make it through this, the life insurance policy plus the accident indemnity would actually set Lily and me up for life. It is almost poetic." The shock hit me harder than the crash. I wanted to vomit, but my throat was paralyzed. Days bled into nights. One evening, he took a phone call right next to my bed. I recognized the voice on the other end immediately. It was Kelsey, the emergency dispatch coordinator from his hospital. "It is probably the best way to end it," Ethan told her, his voice devoid of any sorrow. "She has not been the woman I loved for a long time. This is just biology correcting a mistake." But the worst confession came a few nights later. The room was empty except for us. Ethan was sitting by my bedside, holding my limp hand. He began stroking my knuckles, a gesture that made my skin crawl. "I tried to tell you to get the brakes checked," he whispered. "You always ignore the maintenance lights. So I decided to help you out. I just changed a little thing with the line tension before you took the car out. I thought maybe a scare would teach you a lesson about listening to me." He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I guess the lesson was a bit harsher than I intended. But maybe it is for the best." I lay there, screaming in the silence of my own skull. He had tampered with my car. He had sent me off that bridge. He continued to use my unconscious body as his confessional, treating me like a pillow or a wall. He talked about how alive he felt with Kelsey because she understood the pressure of his job. He detailed his plans to sell our house in West Ridge and liquidate my assets once he gained legal guardianship. He called me a living debt and a failed project that he needed to close out. "You are just an expensive shell now," he muttered one night, smoothing my hair back. "I just need the legal system to catch up so I can stop pretending to hope." Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes, sliding into the breathing tube taped to my face, but I could not make a sound. In that darkness, the despair that threatened to drown me began to harden. It crystallized into something cold and sharp. He thought he was whispering to a corpse. He did not realize he was reading his confession into a recording device. I stopped trying to move. I started to memorize every date, every amount, every admission. I became a hard drive in a broken computer, waiting for the reboot. It took weeks for the command to travel from my brain to my hand, but eventually, my index finger twitched. Then, the heavy curtains of my eyelids finally lifted. The first thing I saw was the sterile white ceiling tiles, followed by the IV drip counting out the seconds of my life. And then there was Ethan. He was standing by the window, but the moment he saw my eyes flutter open, he rushed to the bedside. He looked exhausted. His shirt rumpled just enough to suggest sleepless nights. As the nurse hurried in to check my vitals, Ethan wiped a tear from his cheek with practiced elegance. He was playing the role of the devoted husband to perfection, and for a fleeting second, I almost wanted to believe the performance. He leaned over the bed rail, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt. "You scared me to death, Harper," he whispered, his voice trembling for the benefit of the medical staff. But the moment the nurse turned her back to adjust the monitor, his expression hardened. The warmth evaporated from his eyes, replaced by a cold, clinical assessment. He lowered his voice so only I could hear. "You do not remember anything, do you? It is the brain injury. The doctor said your memory would be like Swiss cheese." I stared at him, my throat too dry to speak, and decided right then to give him exactly what he wanted. I blinked slowly, letting my gaze drift unfocused. The rehabilitation doctor later explained that I had what he called a deficit in processing speed. He said I would be slow to understand complex sentences and that I needed significant rest. I listened to him list my limitations, and I realized he was handing me a shield. If they thought I was broken, they would not guard their secrets around me. I nodded sluggishly, letting my mouth hang slightly open, cementing the image of a woman who was no longer a threat. They moved me to Cedar Oaks Rehab for physical therapy. Learning to walk again was a humiliation I cannot fully describe. My legs felt like foreign objects, heavy and uncooperative. I gripped the aluminum walker until my knuckles turned white, sweat stinging my eyes. Every step sent a jolt of pain shooting up my spine. But I used it. With every agonizing shuffle forward, I replayed Ethan's whispers in my head. One step for the $500,000 in life insurance, another step for Kelsey, another step for the brakes he tampered with. The pain became fuel. My younger brother, Noah, was the first person to look at the situation with clear eyes. He flew in from out of state, a massive wall of muscle who spent his days in a gym but had the heart of a teddy bear. He sat in the plastic chair next to my bed, watching Ethan pace the room. When Ethan launched into his rehearsed story about how I had been driving recklessly and ignoring car maintenance, Noah did not nod along. He narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He knew me. He knew I was the person who double-checked the stove 3 times before leaving the house. When Ethan went to the cafeteria to get coffee, I signaled Noah to come closer. My voice was raspy, barely a croak. "I need a phone," I whispered, "a cheap one. Cash only, no accounts. Hide it." Noah looked at me, confusion clouding his face. Why, he asked. "I want to listen to music while I train." I lied. though I knew he sensed there was more to it. Just do it, please. He brought it the next day, a burner phone from a convenience store, and tucked it into the back of my underwear drawer beneath the compression socks. That plastic brick became my lifeline. Every night, after Ethan went home to sleep in our bed and the night nurse had administered my pain medication, I would pull the phone under the covers. My thumbs were clumsy, but I forced them to work. I opened the Notes app and began to transcribe the black box of my memory. I typed one laborious word at a time. Life insurance 500,000, Kelsey, brake lines. He thinks I forgot. I felt like I was manually reconstructing a corrupted log file, saving the evidence before it could be overwritten. My daughter Lily visited on a Saturday. Seeing her was like inhaling oxygen after holding my breath for months. She ran to me, burying her face in my stomach, smelling of strawberry shampoo and innocence. She asked when I was coming home. I stroked her hair and promised her it would be soon. That promise was not just about location. It was a vow. Ethan had never raised a hand to her, but he was willing to leave her motherless for a payout. I had to get back to that house not just to survive, but to insulate her from the man her father really was. By the time I was cleared for discharge, I had perfected my act. I moved a little slower than I needed to. I asked people to repeat simple questions. I let a look of vacant confusion settle permanently on my face. I decided to go home as a Trojan horse. I would let Ethan believe he was bringing a harmless, broken invalid back into his house. He would feel safe. He would get arrogant, and only when he felt completely secure would he make the mistake that would destroy him. Walking back into our home in the Oak Ridge subdivision felt like stepping into a simulation that had been rendered slightly wrong. The walls were painted the same soft beige, and the furniture was arranged just as I had left it, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle, but to a paranoid mind, it was screaming. The filing cabinet in the study, which used to hold our shared tax returns, was now secured with a new heavy-duty lock. Ethan's desktop computer, which had always been open for family use, now sat behind a biometric two-factor authentication wall. Even the medication box in the kitchen had been reorganized, the bottles lined up with a precision that felt more like a pharmacy than a home. Ethan did not waste time. On my second day back, he brought me a stack of crisp documents while I was resting on the living room sofa. He smiled that tight, patient smile and told me these were just power of attorney forms for convenience. He explained that they would allow him to sign for me on medical and financial matters, so I would not have to worry about the stress of paperwork while I recovered. He uncapped a pen and pressed it into my hand, his grip firm, urging me to sign right there on the coffee table. I let my hand tremble slightly, playing the part. I looked at him with wide, unfocused eyes and told him that the nice lady from the hospital mediation team said I should always let a lawyer read the big papers first. His jaw clenched. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure irritation. Then he smoothed it over, patting my shoulder and telling me he just wanted to protect me. He warned me not to let strangers take advantage of my condition. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Once he left for his shift at the hospital, I retrieved my old laptop from the back of the closet. He had wiped the main drive clean, erasing every photo, every document, and every trace of my digital life. But Ethan was a doctor, not a hacker. He had absolutely no idea that I kept a hidden, encrypted partition on the hard drive for my sensitive work. I stared at the black screen, my brain struggling through the fog to recall the 64-character decryption key. It took 4 tries, sweat beading on my forehead, before the command line finally flashed green. I was back in. I did not need to touch his devices physically to know what he was doing. Using my administrative tools, I accessed our home router. I installed a lightweight piece of malware directly onto the network firmware. It was not destructive. It was simply a ghost. It logged every single packet of data flowing in and out of the house from his computer and smartphone. I routed the logs to store silently onto a portable hard drive that I buried at the bottom of Lily's bin of Lego bricks. I waited 2 weeks before I dared to check the catch, When I finally filtered the logs, the pattern was glaring. Ethan was communicating with a private email server under the handle e.calder_office2. There were also repeated logins to a banking portal for a limited liability company called Brightline Endeavors, a business entity I had never heard of. And then there were the messages to Kelsey, thinly veiled in medical jargon that made no sense contextually. Accessing the secondary email account was pathetic. He had secured it with security questions based on our life together, the city of our honeymoon, the name of our first pet. I reset his password in 30 seconds. Inside, I found the smoking gun. There was a term life insurance policy taken out in my name, with a payout significantly higher than I knew existed, and he was the sole payer of the premiums. But the attachment in the drafts folder was what made my blood run cold. It was a PDF titled Capacity Evaluation. It was written by a neurologist friend of his, a man who had been to our barbecues. The document was already drafted, waiting to be signed, stating that I suffered from severe cognitive decline and required permanent financial guardianship. The full picture snapped into focus. He was not just waiting for me to die. He was engineering a legal cage. He planned to use the coma and this falsified mental evaluation to become my legal guardian. That would give him control over the insurance money and the accident settlement. Then he would divorce me, the incapacitated wife, while keeping all the assets and playing the tragic hero to the public. He thought he had accounted for every variable. He just forgot that the woman he was trying to bury was the one person who knew how to dig up the truth. I needed a shark, not a negotiator. I did not want someone who would suggest marriage counseling or amicable mediation. I needed a lawyer who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent insurance schemes and corrupt guardianships. I found her in a strip mall office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Her name was Ava Torres. She was a sharp-edged woman in her 40s, Latini, with eyes that assessed your net worth and your pain threshold in a single glance. Her firm, Torres and Grayline, was small, but their win record against corporate malfeasance was brutal. We sat in her office, which overlooked a cracked parking lot. I laid it all out. I told her about the accident, the coma, the whispers in the dark, and the guardianship trap Ethan was building. I placed a USB drive on her desk. It contained the network logs, the emails from his secret account, and the scan of the fraudulent capacity evaluation. Ava did not gasp. She did not offer sympathy. She simply took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. When I finished, she looked up, tapping the pen against her chin. "What is the end game here?" she asked, her voice flat. "Do you want revenge, or do you want to survive? I want both," I said, matching her tone. "But I want it done in a way that the law applauds." Ava smiled for the first time. A small, predatory curve of her lips. She agreed to take the case on one condition. I had to continue playing the role of the brain-damaged wife. She needed Ethan to feel comfortable enough to make mistakes. She introduced me to Malik Hart, a forensic financial analyst she kept on retainer. He was a quiet man who treated spreadsheets like crime scenes. His job was to trace the money flowing through Brightline Endeavors and uncover any other offshore accounts Ethan was using to hide the insurance premiums and unverified investments. I emptied my secret savings account, the money I had earned from freelancing before the accident that Ethan knew nothing about. I transferred every cent into an attorney trust account controlled by Ava. This was my war chest. It ensured that no matter how hard Ethan tried to cut off my access to our joint funds, I could still pay for the experts who would destroy him. Ava laid out the strategy. We were to remain passive. We would not file first. We would wait for Ethan to file for guardianship and divorce. By letting him make the first move, we forced him to put his lies on official court documents. Once he swore under penalty of perjury that I was incompetent and that his financial disclosures were accurate, every piece of evidence we had would turn from leverage into a criminal indictment. We spent hours constructing a timeline of guilt. We pinned down the date he took my car for its unscheduled maintenance. We marked the date the life insurance policy was purchased. We correlated the times he visited me in the ICU with the timestamps in the hospital logs where my sedative dosages were inexplicably altered. The pattern was undeniable. I called my brother Noah. I told him only part of the truth, that I suspected Ethan of financial fraud and that he was trying to declare me mentally incompetent to steal my assets. I left out the part about the brake lines for now. I needed him angry, not reckless. I asked him to stand as a character witness, to testify to my mental state and independence before the accident. He agreed without hesitation. Finally, I secured my most important asset. I went to Lily's school and spoke privately with her homeroom teacher and a mother I trusted from the PTA. I told them that my husband and I were going through a difficult legal transition. I gave them explicit instructions. If Ethan or anyone from his family attempted to check Lily out of school early or take her on an unannounced trip, they were to call me or Ava immediately. I was building a fortress around my daughter, ensuring she would not become collateral damage in the war I was about to declare. Ethan escalated his game by bringing the enemy directly into our sanctuary. He introduced Kelsey to me as an old friend and a recovery coordinator who had volunteered to help me readjust to domestic life. It was a bold, insulting move to disguise his mistress as my caretaker, but arrogance often masquerades as charity in his world. I played my part with dedication. I stared at her blankly and called her Kelly. When she corrected me, I called her Casey. I apologized profusely, tapping my temple and blaming the fog in my brain for the mistake. But my eyes were sharp. I watched as she walked into the kitchen and instinctively reached for the cabinet above the dishwasher to grab a mug. She did not ask where we kept the coffee cups. She already knew. She had been playing house in my kitchen long before I woke up, likely drinking from my mugs while I was fighting to breathe on a ventilator. Kelsey was suffocatingly sweet. She called me her warrior sister and constantly patted my hand as if I were a child, yet every compliment had a barb. She would tell me to rest and not to worry about the bills because Ethan was taking care of everything. She was reinforcing the narrative that I was useless and he was the savior. She was there to condition me into accepting my own obsolescence. That night, I lay in bed listening to the murmurs drifting from the living room. Ethan was pacing. He was complaining that the accident insurance payout was being held up in administrative processing. I heard him say that he needed me to sign the guardianship papers to unlock the funds because the bank would not release them without a clear chain of custody. I slipped out of bed, moving silently on the carpet, and slid a small device behind the heavy art books on the bottom shelf of the hallway bookcase. It was a high-sensitivity recorder disguised as a cheap Bluetooth speaker that Noah had mailed to me inside a box of protein bars. Later, when I played it back, the audio was crystal clear. Ethan's voice cut through the static. He said that if I did not wake up fully, they were fine, but if I did wake up and refuse to sign, they would simply prove I was not lucid. He was plotting to gaslight me into a legal straitjacket. The next morning, Ethan made his move. He placed a stack of documents on the breakfast table next to my toast. He told me it was a petition for temporary guardianship. He said his lawyer strongly advised it for my own protection. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a threat. He said that if I did not show the court I was cooperative, they might view my instability as a danger to Lily. My blood ran cold. Using my daughter was the one line he should not have crossed. I forced my hands to shake as if I were terrified. I told him I needed time to read it because the words were swimming. I begged him not to be angry. As soon as he went to the shower to wash off the guilt, I photographed every page and sent them to Ava. Her reply came back instantly with a cold, smiling face emoji. She told me to let him think I was on the verge of signing. While Ethan thought he was closing the net, my team was widening ours. Malik sent me a secure message confirming the money trail. The funds from the shell company Brightline Endeavors were being funneled into a joint account at a regional bank. The names on the account were Ethan Calder and Kelsey Rhodes. They were using the money to pay the mortgage on a luxury condominium in downtown Riverton, but the final blow came from the hospital records Ava had subpoenaed. We found gaps in the nursing logs. There were specific windows of time where Ethan was alone in my room, ostensibly to comfort me. During those exact times, The automated dispensing logs showed no sedative administration by nurses, yet my chart showed sustained deep coma levels. He had not just whispered that he wanted me gone. He had likely been injecting me himself to keep me under, prolonging my silence to ensure his payout. Ethan finally pulled the trigger on his master plan. He filed a formal petition with the Phoenix County Court requesting permanent guardianship over me. Attached to the filing was a capacity evaluation that had been hastily signed by his friend, a neurologist who had attended our backyard barbecues and drank our beer. The report was a masterpiece of vague medical terminology. It claimed I suffered from a lack of cognitive flexibility and executive dysfunction. It was just specific enough to strip me of my rights, but vague enough to be defended if challenged. The court, however, required an independent evaluation. I was ordered to see Dr. Patel, a forensic psychologist with a reputation for being thorough. Ethan drove me to the appointment. In the car and the waiting room, I played my part. I stared at the floor. I fumbled with the buttons on my coat. I stuttered when the receptionist asked for my date of birth. Ethan watched me with a satisfied smirk, confident that I was exactly the broken doll he needed me to be. When the heavy door closed and I was alone with Dr. Patel, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He asked me a simple question about the season, expecting a confused answer. I sat up straight, folded my hands on my lap, and looked him directly in the eye. "It is autumn, Dr. Patel," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "And before we continue with the standard cognitive battery, I would like to discuss the difference between legitimate traumatic brain injury and the chemically induced lethargy my husband prefers to describe in his filings." Dr. Patel dropped his pen. For the next hour, I did not just answer his questions. I ran circles around them. I discussed the encryption protocols I used in my former job. I recalled the dates of every major political event of the last 6 months. I dissected the legal definition of guardianship with the precision of a law student. When our time was up, I softened. I told him I was not looking to file criminal charges today. I simply asked for a fair assessment that was not colored by the prejudice of my coma. He nodded slowly, writing a note in the margin of his pad that I suspected said something along the lines of hyperlucid and legally sharp. While I was dismantling Ethan's narrative in the doctor's office, Ava was dismantling his career at St. Barrow Hospital. The ethics committee was already preparing to meet regarding some statistical anomalies in the emergency room billing. Ethan's name had been flagged for a high volume of high-profit accident cases. Ava decided to throw gasoline on that fire. She sent an anonymous packet to the hospital's legal department. It contained the ICU camera logs cross-referenced with Ethan's visitation hours and the unexplained spikes in my sedation levels. She attached a simple sticky note asking if this looked like a standard medical protocol or a strategy to maximize insurance payouts by prolonging a coma. Ethan received the internal email summoning him for a professional conduct review while we were driving home. I saw his knuckles turn white on the steering wheel. He panicked for a moment, sweat beading on his upper lip, but his arrogance quickly took back the wheel. He told Kelsey over the phone later that it was just administrative nonsense. He convinced himself that once he got the money from the mediation, he could hire a top-tier defense lawyer to make the hospital board back down. He truly believed he was untouchable. Ava leveraged this pressure perfectly. She contacted the family court mediator and suggested we combine the divorce financial hearing with the accident compensation settlement meeting. She argued it would save the court time. Ethan agreed immediately. He was desperate for cash, and he thought this was a sign that we were folding. He wanted everything signed and sealed so he could pay his mounting debts. Malik finally finished his deep dive into Ethan's finances, and the picture was pathetic. My husband was drowning. His consumer debt was astronomical, and his brilliant investments were actually total failures. If he did not secure the insurance payout and keep the house, he was facing personal bankruptcy and the loss of his medical license. He was a man standing on a trap door. The night before the mediation, I sent him a text message. I asked him if I needed to bring anything specific for tomorrow or if he wanted me to pack a snack. It was the text of a dependent, confused wife. He replied almost instantly, "Just sign the papers. Harper, I will take care of you and Lily just like I promised." I looked at the screen and let out a short, cold laugh. He had no idea that he was walking into a room where he would not be the one holding the pen. He thought he was coming to collect his winnings. I knew he was coming to sign his confession. We were back in the glass-walled room at the Phoenix County Mediation Center, and the air was so thick with tension it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. Ethan was oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure. He leaned back in his leather chair, cracking a joke to his lawyer, Monroe, about the stale quality of the complimentary coffee. He checked his platinum watch again, making a show of his impatience. He complained loudly that we were wasting valuable time because Raymond insisted on following the procedural requirement of reading the disclosure documents I had just slid across the table. Monroe cleared her throat and presented their final offer with the grace of an executioner. She explained that under their proposed terms, Ethan would retain full ownership of the house in West Ridge and all primary investment accounts. He would also maintain sole control over the accident compensation funds, arguing that he was the only party with the demonstrated financial capacity to manage such a significant sum. As for me, they were offering a lump sum payment that Monroe described as generous, but which I knew was barely enough to rent a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood for a year. They wanted to buy my silence and my departure for pennies. I remained completely silent. I did not blink. I let Ava speak for me. She gestured to the gray folder and stated that there was a supplementary disclosure that needed to be addressed before any signatures could be collected. Ethan let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He looked at Raymond and told him not to waste his energy reading it. He said that his wife had nothing to disclose other than significant medical debt and perhaps the income from selling a few handmade crafts on Etsy. He looked at me with a smirk that was meant to belittle me into submission. Raymond ignored him. He cut the red tape on the folder and flipped it open. I watched his face closely. He was a professional, trained to keep his expression neutral, but as his eyes scanned the first page, his mask slipped. His eyebrows pulled together. He turned the page, then another, his speed increasing. He saw bank logos he did not expect. He saw the name of a limited liability company that should not have existed. Ethan continued to whisper something to Monroe, chuckling at his own wit, until he realized the room had gone dead silent. He looked up and saw Raymond staring at me. The look on the mediator's face had transformed. The pity was gone. It was replaced by a mixture of apprehension and a sudden, grudging respect. Raymond looked over his reading glasses and asked me for confirmation. He asked if I was the sole proprietor of a company called Lane Shield Security and if the attached contracts with 3 major fintech firms were currently active and valid. Ethan jerked in his seat. He asked what Raymond was talking about. He looked at me, genuinely confused, because in his mind, I had not worked a day since Lily was born. Ava leaned forward and answered for me. She explained that prior to the accident, I had transitioned to high-level freelance consulting through a private entity. She clarified that the contracts were ongoing and that the income generated had been deposited into a separate business account that was never commingled with marital funds, meaning Ethan had absolutely no claim to it. Raymond did not stop there. He turned to the next section of the file. He read aloud the details of the Lane Family Trust. He stated the total assets, a number that sat comfortably in the 7 figures. This was the inheritance left to me by my father, the man Ethan had spent 10 years mocking as a starving artist who did not know how to hold onto a dollar. The trust was structured specifically to remain outside of marital property, managed by a mechanism that kept it invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Ethan sat up straight, the blood draining from his face until he looked like the ghost he had wanted me to be. He stared at me as if I were a stranger who had just walked in off the street. He stammered, his voice losing all its smooth confidence. He asked why I had never told him. I met his gaze with a calmness that terrified him. I told him that I had tried to tell him many times in the beginning, but he had always cut me off because he was convinced that money was a language only he knew how to speak. Raymond turned the page to the section labeled Special Appendix. His eyes scanned the transcript I had provided, which included a direct link to the audio files hosted on a secure server. He read the lines where Ethan and Kelsey discussed using a falsified psychiatric evaluation to force a guardianship. Then, he reached the part where Ethan admitted to tampering with the brake lines of my car before the accident. Ethan shot up from his chair, knocking it back against the glass wall. "That is a violation of privacy," he shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "You cannot record people in their own home without consent." Ava did not even look up from her notes. "Actually," she said calmly, "the admission regarding the breaks was first made in a hospital room where you had no reasonable expectation of privacy, and then you voluntarily repeated the confession in the common area of the marital home. It is entirely admissible." Raymond looked up, his face grim. He stated that he was legally obligated to forward this file to the district attorney and the state medical board. He looked down at the paper and read one of Ethan's quotes out loud to the room. "If she never wakes up, everything will be easier for all of us." The words hung in the air like smoke. I reached into my purse and pulled out a smaller black USB drive. I slid it across the mahogany table toward Raymond. "This contains the video logs from the ICU camera system," I said. "It shows multiple instances where Ethan entered my room alone at 2 a.m. The timestamps match perfectly with the unexplained spikes in sedative levels recorded in my chart. He was not visiting me. He was injecting me to keep me in a coma so he could secure the insurance payout." Ethan spun toward his lawyer, panic vibrating off him. "Monroe, do something," he screamed. "Stop them." Monroe closed her laptop with a definitive snap. "Mr. Calder," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a judge's gavel, "I strongly advise you to remain absolutely silent. From this moment forward, anything you say can and will be used against you in a criminal homicide investigation." For the first time in our marriage, Ethan was forced to shut his mouth. Ava slid a new settlement agreement across the table. It was brutal and simple. She proposed that I retain 100% of the accident compensation as punitive damages for his bad faith acting. I would keep the house in Westridge until Lily turned 18. Ethan would receive supervised visitation only, pending a family court review of the criminal evidence. He would assume all marital debt, including his failed investments, and he would have zero access to the Lane family trust. Raymond looked at the pile of evidence and then at Ethan. "If this goes to trial, Mr. Calder, you are looking at charges for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and the immediate revocation of your medical license. I suggest you sign this agreement to mitigate the civil damages before the criminal investigation begins." Ethan looked like a building undergoing a controlled demolition. He slumped into his chair. His hand trembled violently as he picked up the pen. He signed every page, surrendering his claim to my life, my money, and my future. I signed opposite him with a steady hand, using a cheap ballpoint pen. I watched the ink dry, remembering how he once called me a burden. That burden had just crushed him. As we stood up to leave, Ethan looked at me with hollow eyes. "You heard everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You heard me the whole time." I paused, looking down at him. "You gave me too much time to lie there and listen to who you really are," I said. "I just did what a survivor is supposed to do." I walked out of the mediation center and into the late afternoon sun. I had removed my leg brace that morning, and for the first time in a year, I walked without pain. I pulled out my phone and called the preschool. I told the teacher I would be there right on time to pick up Lily. The rhythmic beeping of the ICU monitor that had haunted my nightmares was finally gone, replaced by the anticipation of my daughter's laugh. As I unlocked my car, I thought of Ethan alone in that cold room. When he whispered what he really thought of me while I was in a coma, he had no idea that day would mark the last time he ever got to decide anything about my life. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Ethan's karma. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and press that hype button to help this video get recommended to more people.